I could go on and on talking about my dad and how he's a hero to me, but I always like to think a little further back than that. It's like, who got my dad involved in cars and racing and hot rods? And it's really interesting when you think about it. My dad had kind of a troubled childhood, kind of a tough life. His mom was like 15 years old when she had my dad, so she wanted to give him up, and you know, it was kind of an interesting situation where his grandma took him in, her mom. It was, I'm sure, pretty tough, and you know, so my dad was looking for a male role model. So enter my great uncle, Jim Matthews, who was actually my dad's uncle. Jim was just this amazing guy. He was a larger-than-life fellow who also had kind of a tough upbringing. You know, he was sent to his uncle's farm and from an early age, and spent all summers just, you know, detasseling corn. And so he grew up big and strong and tough. And when he was able to pool enough money together, he bought a Model A Roadster. So he and his brother Joe would cruise around in this little Model A Roadster, drive around Lake Mitchell in Mitchell, South Dakota, and they would raise all kinds of ruckus. So you have Jim, who's this larger-than-life, really charismatic guy involved with cars and racing, and then you have my dad, who's looking for a male role model, right? And so he meets Jim as he's growing up, and instantly Jim becomes his hero. You know, Jim you know, has a following. People know who he is. He becomes quite famous in South Dakota as a race car driver. So my dad's grandma, my great grandma, would take him to the races and watch Jim race all the time. And Jim would stop by and drop off slot car tracks and bicycles and do all this really great stuff for my dad, you know, knowing that he had kind of a bad shake in life. So you know, it was really interesting to kind of hear my dad talk about Jim throughout my childhood. You know, Jim is why I did this, or Jim is why I did that. You know, he'd tell me about how he would do crazy things on gravel roads in his '69 Chevelle because that's how Jim would have driven, you know, out at the racetrack. And Jim incidentally passed away the year before I was born in 1976. He died in a race car accident at the Sioux Empire Fair racetrack. And so it was a guy that I never knew, but yet I knew he was someone who had such a tremendous influence on my family. And had it not been for him and probably the kindness that he showed to my dad wouldn't have been involved in cars, and therefore I wouldn't have been involved in cars. And it's just kind of crazy, you know, working at the museum, being as heavily involved in cars as I am now, to think that just a few little twists and turns in history kind of made it so. It's fascinating. I wish I could have met Jim. I wish I could talk to him right now because I hear the stories. You know, they wrote a book about him, which is pretty crazy. This is written by a man named Tom Savage, who's a racing historian. This book was written in 1978, just a couple years after Jim had passed away. And I read this book and like memorized it as a kid. And you know, it talks about, you know, Jim, and you know, not only what a great racer he was. I think he sent more 32 Fords and 40 Fords to the scrap iron pile than just about anyone. But they talked about what a great person he was to his fellow racer and just to the community, and I think that's great.
Yeah, that's awesome. Did you have something in there you wanted to share?
Yeah, you know, this is kind of cool. You know, this book starts off with a little bit of a description of Jim, cool. which is neat. For a guy that's never met him, this kind of, I think, puts a little bit of perspective on who he was. And this is written by Tom Savage. I'll never forget the first time I saw Jim. It was June 1954 at the old Sioux Speedway. The night's events were concluded, and I, along with several other interested fans, went down to the grandstands to see cars and drivers. Many people had already gathered in the pit of the black and white 37 Ford Coupe. Then I saw Jim. My very first impression of the man was that he resembled a movie actor, Marlon Brando, in the scene from the movie On the Waterfront. In that particular scene, Brando had just survived a street brawl and appeared worn out, dirty, and tougher than a bag of nails. Jim was wearing blue jeans and a t-shirt. Both were grimy from racetrack dirt. This t-shirt was bulging at its seams from the powerfully built arms and chest. Except for where the goggles had protected his eyes, his face was caked with dirt and sweat. Small trickles of sweat had drooped strands of his hair across his forehead. His eyes were piercing, and he wore a cocky grin on his face. That's pretty funny. In the right hand, he grasped a cold can of beer. At that very moment, he looked like he could have taken Brando in a back alley brawl. He looked like a mean, arrogant, selfish bully. but he wasn't. Throughout his driving career, we all found out that Jim was none of those things. He was the opposite. He was a race driver who was thoughtful of his fellow competitors at all times. He was a loving, sharing man, and he was humble in his victories and gracious in his losses. And it's just, I think, a pretty cool description of a guy that, you know, kind of set my life on its course, which is pretty cool.
I love that because you can almost see him, you know, you can
Yeah,
picture it with that description. I don't know about you, Jess, but I'm kind of curious to hear a little bit about his racing history. Was he more of a local racer, or
yeah,
tell
you
us
know,
a little bit about that?
He started out when it was just the barnstorming days, right? So he was taking old Model A's and 40 Fords and, you know, just running the tar out of them. So he's had these very humble beginnings, you know, in the early 50s, and raced all through the 50s and 60s, and then, you know, at the very end of his life, he's racing against Doug Wolfgang. I mean, it's really cool. We had Doug Wolfgang at the museum the other day, and I was really looking forward to seeing him. And he said, "Are you Tim Matthews?" And I said, "Yeah, I am." He said, "You know, I got to tell you the story." He said, "When I was a small boy living in Mitchell, South Dakota, I used to sneak into the concrete plant, and I used to ask Jim about his racing and, you know, how he was doing and what kept him on top. And, you know, he would share with me all these things. Just a small boy, you know, but he cared about, you know, telling me these things because he knew I was interested." He said, "Fast forward, my parents moved me from Mitchell to Sioux Falls, bigger city, and I didn't see Jim anymore. And later I found out," Doug said, "that he was kind of hurt because I wasn't coming around anymore, and he didn't know why." He said, "So I started racing, and he came to me at the track and he said, you know, hey, I missed you, you know, what happened?" And I told him the whole story, how he moved. He said, "But the craziest thing is when I finally beat him in a race." He said he came up to me and he grabbed me by the shirt and he lifted me straight off the ground with a straight arm. And he said, "I've never seen anybody able to do that ever." He said he just had this superhuman strength, and he said, "Don't ever do that again." And he put me back on the ground, and he said that's all there was to it. But it was just a great relationship.
It's amazing how legends are built, and it sounds like his is built on kindness.
Exactly. It's cool, you know. I mean, we have a few of his trophies at my house, you know, the original trophies that he won. And, you know, he had some great team members, you know, that got behind him and helped him win. You know, he always raced Ford products, you know, in a time where the small block Chevy became kind of king. You know, he kept racing Fords, and this car was called Blue Thunder. And you know, my dad used to talk about wearing a Ford t-shirt to school, you know, to show, you know, his pride for his uncle, and he'd get beat up for wearing a Ford t-shirt to school. I actually found one of his old cars. It exists next to this old barn. Of course, you know, I knocked on the guy's door. I said, "Hey, you know, would you sell me the car?" It's a 32 Ford, and it's all cut up. You could never make it into a street car again. But I just love it because it belonged to Jim. And he said, "No way." He said, "I love Jimmy. I'm going to restore the car someday." I'm like, hey, cool, you know, so at least it's, you know, kind of a good, it's good that his memory still lives.
Yeah.